what are some advancements that you guys want to see in the herp hobby today? Did it
Me?
freeze? Oh, sorry. I
I,
didn't know if it froze because you guys
I,
just kind of stood there.
I was being
Oh no,
polite,
I
but
was gonna let Brian go first.
I think the most important thing that could be an advancement per se is understanding, being able to genuinely understand the captives that we have and really know what they need. Like we were talking about in the beginning part of this, all of that unknown husbandry, because a lot of it was based out of the success of breeding or what have you. I think we really need to learn the science behind it. And I think it's coming. And I think it's finally in a real position to start taking the dominant position over this hobby. And I think it's on its way, finally. I've been watching it for a long time. But I guess, and people's opinions. I think people need to understand that it's not something you can argue about. Once you're presented a factual study, you genuinely can't argue that your care is perfection if you're being presented with so much information done in a very scientific way using the scientific method, which eliminates a lot of those variables that everyone assumes is okay, because some of it's not okay. And I think that's a big part of where we're headed in the future. And I mean, within the next 10 years, I think it's going to be a completely different hobby.
Now, I have a
I can
good
believe it.
story for you, real quick. A good example. Play devil's advocate here for a second. So, there was a time. This is the old Frog Forum days. If some people are watching this and they actually read that post, or maybe it was Dendroboard, I don't remember, but this was a good topic that we covered. So I asked them on one of those two groups. I said, "So, what would the proper diet be for a wild gray tree frog?" Um, and it was interesting. I got a guy from Oregon, a guy in the zoo, and he sent me an article. And I think it was there was a study done on eastern gray tree frogs. I believe it was in Missouri, or it was another state that they're from. It was not Pennsylvania, but he shared that study, and the study said they eat like beetle larvae and ants and grasshoppers and moths and beetles. But in their discussion, they said this is only at this time of the year. We don't have data for the other times of the year. So whenever I pulled that out and I asked them, I said, "So what do you do with the other parts of the year?" The zookeeper said, "What are you talking about? Like that's all they eat." And I said, "Well, no, they found that in their data, like right, that was the results. But in their discussion, they said we don't have all of it. So how can my question was to the guy in Oregon was how can you like just say, even though it is in the study, how do you dismiss the discussion part of it and say, well, what about the end of the year? What do they eat in the fall? What do they eat in the spring? We know what they eat in the summer, and we know in the meta population what they eat, but what do they eat in other parts of the country where, maybe they don't have that beetle, or there's not enough ants, or there's not enough beetle grubs? Like, so I agree with you um, for what you said, but I also think people have to be very locked in on what they're reading, because that was a situation where a guy who's working in a zoo completely ignored the discussion point about that paper.
Right.
So that's the only point I want to make is we also have to be careful that we're also testing what they're finding in these papers, because if we just go off of what they say, there can be bias, or there could be misrepresentation or misunderstanding sometimes. And I'm not saying that what you said. I'm just saying for others to hear that, because especially being in that field myself, like we have to continuously compare and read each other's work and understand, how did you come to that conclusion, and um, where did you get your data from, or is this a full representation, is this just a part of it, like a limited data set, so stuff like
How
that. But
long ago was that study written?
uh probably 10 or more years ago.
Right. See, that's where a lot of the information is. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of people have run with. And that's why we have a lot of this husbandry that's not quite perfect,
I
or
just think that playing around with seasonality in keeping is a really interesting frontier that might become more
oh yeah,
explored and more prevalent and stuff in the next few years in terms of changing around with what kinds of feeders are offered and what ratios and temperatures and photo periods and stuff like that.
yeah, I agree.
I think especially be beneficial for breeding, but just for enrichment's sake and stuff and things that might really need to brumate as well.
Yeah. Why do you think I'm so high on ants? Because I mean, not just all the animals that I have eat them, and it seems to be a large portion of their diet, but how many lizards, how many other exotic frogs eat ants, but we know nothing about that. Or if even if we do, like most people aren't willing to go that mile. And I'm not
Yeah,
saying we,
currently it's a thing that the handful of people who are trying to keep horned lizards work with. Like that's
Yep.
something that they're playing around with at work, and so those folks are pretty much obligated to be breeding ant colonies because that's such an essential part of those lizards' diet. But
Hmm.
I think that making that more widespread for species that do also eat ants, now they'd have to probably go with some species that have maybe a lower formic acid content since that can be toxic. But I think that if it can be done in ways that they're not going to be getting out and causing infestations and stuff, which is possibly a real concern, that would be a good thing for more folks to be including.
yeah, no, I
Especially if
completely
you're
agree.
working with a species that is highly invasive and could potentially destroy
Exactly.
its an ecosystem. Yeah, there's a lot of entomology that I don't even pretend to know, but I know there's a lot of things that you're not allowed to ship to the United
Oh, for
States,
sure.
um,
Yes.
Yeah.
via insect wise,
Yep.
and a lot of those ant species that most of those ant specific feeders are feeding on are the ones that you're not supposed to have. I know that, but you
Right.
know,
I used to work on or I was the caretaker for art slash science exhibition a few years ago, in which the project that I was overseeing the maintenance of involved a live leafcutter ant colony that
That's
was
awesome.
being kept in a museum, and there
neat.
was equipment hooked up to be able to actually translate the little sounds that the ants made to each other to communicate to amplify them so that humans could actually hear the ants kind of speaking and stuff as they went about their days, and got like a little bit of a glimpse into sort of what some of those legal processes for transferring those kind of things and what can and can't be shared around and kept for certain periods of time, and in certain, like what kind of facilities have to be in place to hold certain species. And there's just a ton that goes into it with ants, and I'm
Yeah.
sure other groups of insects as well.
Yeah. It makes me very surprised that some of the legislations and proposed legislations that are coming down the pike for reptile stuff weren't happening sooner either, especially since it has been for many, many years so drastically hard to ship, keep, and transport insects across state lines federally or import. So it's very surprising, but not surprising.
Well, ants are interesting for a main reason that like they're actually one of the few groups that's being decriminalized in a lot of ways. So like a guy who I work with, and I'm actually going to get some ants for a bigger project. Maybe we can talk about at the end of this, but shout out to Tar Heel Ants. He also supplies Josh's frogs with their ants. But
Awesome.
there's a lot of permits that the guy has, and if it's legal in your state, and if it's usually either a native species or it's fire, what is it, not fire ants, the ants you guys are keeping for the lizards, like there's only a handful of species that could be shipped statewide, like to different states. So like they would never give you the chance to own fire ants unless it's illegal. But like the way that like Mac runs Tar Heel Ants, he has all the permits and he knows what states allowed what, and like you can't pull anything over on him. Like I never tried, but he's told me stories about people trying to get ants that they weren't allowed to have, and he won't do it. So like
It's like folks who are working with breeding grasshoppers. That's another
yeah.
thing that's
Yeah.
starting to be kind of an up and coming possibility in the reptile world
Oh,
that
I'm all about
has a
that.
lot of legislation involved in it. There's only a few people who readily, regularly breed and distribute certain species that are allowed to be transferred around because they're so widespread as it is, and they're not cheap. I picked up some at the Tinley Park convention for my animals because I've been able to only really get to purchase grasshoppers to include in my guys' diets like once or twice a year or so at expos, and it was like
Buy it up.
yeah, it was
Yeah.
basically like $1 a pop or something like that was the rate
That'd be
right
amazing to
now.
have it though. Like the two things, if you'd ask me, excluding ants, that I would love to see get into the hobby would definitely be grasshoppers at one. Number two might surprise you guys. It's supposedly it could be the next big thing for crickets, ants, and roaches as like a staple feeder, but actually earwigs. Earwigs are, if you look into their like what they are, one of the perfect creatures as a feeder for frogs and toads and some lizards. Even the European earwig, like I'm not going to do it with them, but I'd love to get a colony of some type of earwig because they're a soft-bodied creature and they seem to eat just about anything like a roach. They have parental care. Some of them can be kept in groups, some of them can't. They come in so many different sizes. They usually don't fly. Majority of them don't invade your house. So, you know, I think it's one of the most ideal situations for earwigs. I could see that in the next 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it would be good. I mean, any universal positive change in the availability of a feeder animal, I fully support that. I think varied diet is the key to success with almost all species. When I was first keeping Savannah monitors as a great example, they were all imported. No, I mean, even still, they're pretty much all imported. And everybody fed them mice. Everybody fed them heavy protein meats constantly. And back to your, Amelia, the comment you made about brumation. This is an animal that regularly goes without food for months in the wild. Why do you think it can eat the way that it can in the wild and not suffer from fatty liver disease like they do in captivity? Because they don't eat for X amount of time. And that's a necessity for their body to be able to ward off those negative side effects from eating too much other foods. Um, and when you're power feeding or feeding too heavily, they become very ill. And it will change with the advent of adding more nutritious feeders. You change the health and husbandry of the animals in your care. It's a great positive direction that this hobby could really use.
Another
And I would
thing
really
that
like to see crickets not as prevalent as they are.
another thing that friend of mine's been telling me about recently is there's starting to be studies about how insects do benefit from and have nutritional consequences, I guess, positive consequences from UV exposure, like how we use it for
That's
reptiles
awesome.
and stuff. And I never would have thought of that before a few months ago because I don't know.
What
I guess you just
species?
think of, uh, I think they were talking about crickets mainly, but I'm sure that's got to be kind of across the board to some extent. Like if things that are sort of crepuscular and whatnot, nocturnal like crickets have an impact, then probably also you'd also be seeing effects on diurnal insects and whatnot. Um, so it's like maybe in the future we'll be keeping our feeder insect colonies a lot like we keep our
Yep.
reptiles and having them have basking areas and stuff like that so that they have more vitamin D and whatnot when they come.
It's a good idea. Boy,
I actually do that with my Madagascan hissing cockroach colony.
Nice.
They're in there's probably 20 or 25 adults, and they're in a very, I don't want to say sparse, but it's not there's no vegetation because they just eat everything. They're completely dominating.
that's the problem with roaches,
Um,
yeah.
but there's millions of pieces of cork bark, and it's 24 inches tall by 18 by 18, and they utilize every floor space imaginable, and they utilize every vertical space imaginable, and it's so funny to see. They're breeding very, very well. But I have a ceramic heat emitter on them, and I have a UV light on them, and
Mm-hmm.
their population is exploding. I mean, I've kept them for years because I used them as the beginning of educational lectures, and I'll put them on my hands and walk around the library audience as people are coming in and stuff. And people are like, oh, the reptile guy. And then they'll see the bugs in my hand and run away. So it's perfect. It works really, really well. They go find their seat real quick when you're holding like 3 or 4 5-inch roaches. But I've never really had success breeding them. And once I changed them into this new enclosure with this secondary setup of UV and heat, they started breeding pretty easily. I know they're very easy to breed. I breed the crap out of dubia roaches, but for some reason, Madagascan hissers never really did it for me. They didn't want to breed for me. I don't know what parameter I was doing wrong, but within this habitat, whatever I was doing wrong has now corrected itself, and they've been healthy. I mean, I haven't had a single death of an adult in the 2.5 years I've had, or 2 years I've had the colony going.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I've seen people also start to consider trying to do more of that kind of thing for their tarantulas, providing more of heat gradients, light gradients, humidity gradients, all that kind of thing, give them different microclimates and stuff to choose. And that's something that I think you'd be kind of like, yep, I know that feeling, Aaron, that the people who I've seen really promoting that kind of thing are sort of seeing like pushback right now from a fair number of people, where it's like, how do you know you're not just stressing them out? It's just an invertebrate. They've been doing fine, kind of thing.
Yeah.
A lot of people, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that was about the end of the thought.
A lot of people ask me like why I don't have more per se, or like why I don't want more. Like now that Ian's in Pennsylvania, even like, oh, do you want chameleons? Do you want this frog? It's like,
oh, he's always gonna try and give everybody chameleons.
But the reason why I don't take the stuff is because I'm hoping at some point to enable my feeder colonies. I think it would be an amazing situation if I could get my canyon isopods to be big enough that I could feed them off and throw them in as like cleanup crew. Like I have a dubia roach, a small terrarium. I'd love to give them a bigger terrarium, like you're saying, and even add UVB, because I think it would be really cool to see what happens. They're probably the most prolific breeder I have right now, and I just got orange head roaches. And I also have crickets and mealworms. So like, and I keep that stuff all, like I have it on me all the time. Like they're always in the house. 4 out of the 5 I said are breeders, like the canyon isopods, both of the roaches, and when I get the ants.
You say I have them on me all the time. I'm just picturing you just like reaching into your pockets and pulling out like handfuls of mealworms and isopods.
I don't know if I'm gonna show my age now, but I was thinking of the cartoon from the 90s with Scrooge McDuck swimming through his money. That was what went through my mind, of someone swimming through a bunch of dubia roaches. Sorry, Aaron, that was definitely an interesting visual. Appreciate that.
But yeah, like I always have them around, and I'm very interested in doing that, because I agree. Like even if I see them in the enclosures drowning, like I get in there, I pull them out. Like I'm not like, oh, it's just like a cricket drown. Like it doesn't matter. Like to me, it does. Like I don't wish them harm. And I think sometimes we can actually get enjoyment out of hanging out with the feeder creatures. Like crickets are actually very interesting when you get to watch them. They're very active, and like how
There's
roaches.
Definitely a satisfaction in watching them for a while. Like I'll sometimes just kind of sit there and watch them when I go and I put in a fresh load of food for all of my crickets and stuff. And if I've got like a variety of like vegetables and fruits and gut load powder and stuff, like I've been using that Missouri stuff you suggest, and then also kind of blending in some other stuff to attract them to it. I'll kind of watch and see like what are they going for the most. Do they like kind of stick to one food item, or like does an individual go around and pick at everything? And it's just kind of neat.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the reason why I know it's not as favored, but I do kind of like crickets for that, being so active. And anyway, the whole point of what I'm trying to make is like I would love to incorporate some of that stuff, because I have very large enclosures, which means to me personally, I'm not going to have like a giant collection if I don't have to. I don't want to have to be surrendering them to Brian because I can't take care of them. But I
Don't
also right, and that too, yeah, I'd have to think about that. But no, I mean I want to have nice enclosures too for the insects, because again, like we just talked about, that's what's going into our animals. So they might as well, it's kind of like cows in some ways. You know, you don't want them to live in poop and live miserably. Like my roaches in the canyon isopods probably have nicer setups than some people have for their frogs, and it's kind of sad. But you know, then when they get fed off, they're probably much healthier than if they were in a very stressful situation.
Yeah, no, my roaches they have a much more varied diet than I do. they're, they're getting fresh vegetables constantly. I'm you know, a salad every couple days kind of guy. But it definitely, I mean, they eat fresh vegetables and fruits constantly. A lot of it isn't, you know, isn't old or expired. It might be like it's been in my fridge a little too long. I'll bring it to the roaches, or a couple
Yep.
pieces of bird bread to the roaches at the end of the day. You know, just whatever you know, they'll eat anything. I've put all kinds of stuff. I've even put snake shed in there before. Gone. They eat it right up. It's crazy. It's crazy what they eat. They're one of the toughest animals on the planet. I'm pretty sure they'll survive anything. I mean, we already know that, so I shouldn't even have to say it. But